Hello, everybody. My name's Andrew, and I'm here with the second video in the series on looking at the Bebras, in particular challenges. And in this particular video, we are going to look at three specific challenges. We're going to look at Pathfinder's cost of petrol. We're going to look at challenge 2, Pathfinder's saving up. And we're going to look at challenge 3, IP4 validation, which is related to network IP addresses. Now, before we get started into the challenges, we need to have a little look at some code and to try to understand the process of these challenges and what we're going to need to create them. So let's begin here with our first question. Now, in this question, we are asked to write a Python program that takes a single line of input from the user, and this input will contain several numbers separated by spaces. Now, this is super common in the challenges and in the Bebras of doing this. So what we want to look into is how can we deal with this? So, for example, this would be an input here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, obviously separated by space, because if you don't separate it by space, then the program will read it as, like, say, 12, as 34, and so on. So they need to be separated by space. Okay, so this is a template. Over here, I've given you some code that you can have a look at. And if you wish to try this on your own, then I suggest you stop the video now and have an attempt at filling in the missing blanks and completing this challenge. Don't forget that you need to print out each number line by line. So in other words, you take in the data in series, like so, and then you print it off essentially in parallel, like this, line by line. Okay, let's have a look at the solution. So the first thing we want to do is we want to declare a variable, which is this one here. We then take an input from the user, which is here. Notice there's nothing in the input. So it could be a bit better if we just write something simple like enter your numbers. By doing this, it just makes it a little bit easier for the user to understand what's going on. And then we print what the type is, and that type should print out a string. It prints out a string because anything read from the input is in string format. So that should be a string. Now what we do is we take the user input and we split it up, because remember that the input looks like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we want to split that up, and we want to find out what each one of those are individually. So essentially what we're doing is we're putting these numbers into an individual list. Now, one thing you should know about this, and basically answers the questions over here, number 1 and number 2, that is, when we use split for a user input, it splits up the numbers like we see here, but it still makes them into strings. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to print them out line by line by using a casting here. This is something called casting. And what casting does is it converts one form of data type into another data type. In this case, it converts each number, which is string, into an actual number. And then it prints them out because of the print command here. Okay, so that small program there will convert the numbers that we have coming in here into the numbers going out line by line, because it's running around the for loop, which we have over here. So to answer these questions, what's the data type of variable user input? It's a string. What's the data type of each element? It's still a string. And that's why we need to cast it over here into integers. Question number 2, another common scenario in the exams is to add up the values. So let's have a look what we need to do here. We're going to take in 3 numbers as an input. In this case, I've added enter 3 numbers. But you don't need to, because it doesn't ask you to in these challenges to do that. It just makes it easier for the user. So we're going to separate them by spaces again, not commas. We're going to create a function. So I hope that you guys know what a function is. In case you don't, I'm going to show you here. A function is simply a piece of code that can be called multiple times throughout the life of a program, and it performs a simple action like printing out a value or even returning a value. In this case, we're just going to look at the printing part of it, because all we need to do is print the calculated sum. So very simply, this is a template. I suggest you stop the video now, pause the video, and if you want to try to do this on your own, fill in the blanks that you see here, 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 and obviously you can write some more code here if you need to. All you have to do is take the numbers that are entered, in this case 10, 15, 8, and print out the solution, which is the summation of them. Let's have a look at the program and how we're going to do that. As we can see in this first section, we are simply taking the input from the user. In that case, it's going to be whatever numbers they enter, 3, 4, 5, etc. In this part of the code, we are breaking them down. So I'm grabbing each one of these individually, separating them out. And then we're having a look at what that type is. And you'll find that they are still a string. Just like in the previous example, when we use a split command, we still get a string. So somewhere in our code, which happens to be in our function here, we need to cast them again into integers so that we can add them together. So the simple solution is make a variable, which we're going to call sum, and assign it to a value of 0. Start a for loop, which here we assign a variable number, which is a variable which is going to grab every number inside the numbers array. And the numbers array, as you could see from the start of the program, contains the numbers that we entered before. So basically it grabs number 3, it brings it over here, essentially. It converts it into an integer. And then what we can see here is the next line of code inside the for is sum plus equals. This is shorthand for sum equals sum plus int number. It casts that number and it adds it back into sum. So basically it's a running count keeping track of that sum. So it's going to do 3 plus 4 plus 5, which is going to be 12 in this case. And so you can see at the end of the program here, we actually call the function. That is the name of this. We pass to it numbers, and in that function, we actually have the print command here, which is going to print out. Let me just clear the screen. So, and we're going to print out finally the sum at the end. Remember, this is going to loop around for however many numbers you enter into the system. And that's it. A nice little program to count the summation of the numbers. Number 3 now, before we go to the challenges, we need to look at how do we incorporate if-else functions within the concept of the for loops and the adding numbers and taking numbers from the input and so on. So in this challenge, or in this question, we'll say, we want to write a program to take 5 integers. So let's say 4, 9, 3, 1, 4. They can be anything from 0 to 100. Now, quite often it asks for this in the challenges in the exam, but you don't have to incorporate the code to check for it. Okay, we'll talk about that later when we do the challenges. I want you to make a function. which is called determine grade. And this function contains if-else statements, which simply check if it's between this range, if it's between this range, if this one, and so on and so on. So if you're looking for a bit of a challenge today, then I suggest you pause the video, try to complete this challenge, and then unpause it, and we're going to go through the solution. Here is a solution to the problem, and we start off with exactly the same code we had previously. So we're kind of building on the code as we go along here. This part here takes in your 5 numbers. This part here splits those numbers. So let's write them again. Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This part over here breaks those numbers down, separates them. And so they are now ready to be analyzed. And again, in the function here, we need to do some casting. Why? Because we're dealing with numbers and we want to check them with integers. We can't do this if they remain as strings as they do here. So this is a very nice little piece of code. We have a for loop in the external part here. And this is going to run around each number that we have inside the scores. So score is a variable which grabs each one of the scores that we enter, in this case 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And these are then going to be compared in the ifs. So it's going to run down here and it's going to check the number. And if that number is any one of these values, so let's say we have 95, then it will run the first one and it will not run any of the other ones. So the grade will be returned as A. If my second number is 80, then it's going to run the second one and it's not going to run anymore. It's going to return B. If I then have 60, it's going to return this one over here, which is D. And if it doesn't have any of these values, remember that the limit is 0 to 100, so we can't go over 100. Therefore, if the value is less than 60, it must jump into the else, which is essentially the dropout part of the code. And when you run into the dropout part of the code, then it's going to give you an F. So anything less than 60 is going to give you an F. And then all we do is we just print out the function call that we pass scores to. And this is the function over here with def determine grade. Okay. So that's kind of like a warm-up now for the actual challenges, which is what we're going to do now. Let's go straight to our first challenge. And our first challenge is actually the cost of petrol. So if you go over here to UK Bebras, we can see that the cost of petrol is over here. It's worth 4 points. And here is the challenge. Okay. As we did in the previous video, we're going to use Blockly and Python editor, which was kindly developed by the company and is very useful in helping us understand the code and the blocks. And let's go back now to the presentation where I have simplified the text and I've wrote it on here. So challenge 1, let's get into this. Challenge 1 is all about the emissions of a petrol car. And the main information that we're given is that it burns 1 litre of petrol. When it burns 1 litre of petrol, it uses 0.0024 tons of CO2. And essentially, all we want to do in this code is we want to enter lots of different values, to be precise, the 12 months that we've been using our car. And we want to enter how many litres of petrol we've used each month. And based on that number, we are simply going to multiply it by the amount here of CO2 that it produces. And that should then give us a rounded off value. Now, this one is a little bit tricky because, first of all, you should try to make sure that each one of these values is between 0 and 200. But if you make these values quite small, for example, if you just do this, 10, 20, 15, 12, and so on, and you multiply the value by 0.0024, by the time you round them off to the nearest whole number, that could actually come out many times as 0. So when you test this system, try to make sure that the numbers are as close to 200 as possible so that we can get an actual valid figure. Like in this case, the numbers you see actually produce 5. But in some cases, they go over the 200 mark. So we're going to have to reduce these when we enter our own. Again, you don't have to check. You don't have to have a check in the system for if the number is between 0 and 200. I think it's a good idea to do this, but you don't need to for the challenge. Okay, so that's the challenge. Let's get straight over to the code and start making this. Okay, first thing we want to do is make a variable and get the input. You can see on the left-hand side, it's producing the blocks. And I could leave it just like that now. I don't have to change it at all. But I'm not going to. I'm going to say enter 12 numbers separated by a comma, because this is essentially what the question asks. Now, in this case, I'm going to split them straight away. So what I can do is just literally split like so. Instead of, if you remember when we looked at the code before, we actually did this on 2 separate lines, but you can do it all in one line, as you can see by the blocks over here. Okay, next is to set a total. Let's make it equal to 0. I'm declaring the value that's going to hold the final result. Now we need a for loop. And we need a for loop because we want to grab all of the liters, which are the 12 values we're going to enter. We want to grab them all, and we're going to put them into our for loop so we can start getting a total together here. Total equals total plus, don't forget the casting. We talked about this earlier. When you use a split command, it splits the data into strings. So we need to cast it back into integers because you can't add strings together. Well, you can, but they're going to be added together as concatenation, which means they're just going to be 5 and 5 instead of 10, 5 plus 5. So be a little bit careful with that. And the last thing we need to do here is just print out the result. The result is going to be total, which we found from the for loop, times our fixed value, 0.24. And that is the simplest way of doing this code. We don't even need to have this here. But I think it's a good idea to have that. Okay, that looks like it. So let's put some values in. And remember what we said before. We need those values to be quite big. Otherwise, it could possibly come out at 0. Okay, let's run it. Here we go. I'm going to go with 180, 190, 170, 169, 195, 160. I'm trying to keep these values quite high. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's 10. That's 11. And that is 12. And we can see now in the bottom window, we have 5.279. So obviously that rounded off is going to give us 5. So one thing we can do there is very simply go into here and just have an int. And what that does is that's just going to round off that value to 5. And that is the final program. It's the final code. That does everything that we are asked for in the challenge, and our output is actually the same as their example output, 5. Nice. Okay, let's go over to the next one. So we'll delete this one. Let's go over to our presentation. Now, of course, there is alternative ways of writing that program. We can make it a little bit more in-depth by actually including a check for the numbers of 0 to 200. That would be one check. So a way of doing that would be is to have an if loop, and we could just like have an if loop which essentially checks between the values. So it'd be something like this, and that will check to make sure that every number is between 0 and 200. Another check we could do is that the length of liters is equal to 12. So we could say that if the length of liters does not equal 12, then we could print an error. Yeah, again, you don't need to do this, but this is something that you would do normally in practice to check for these numbers not to go over 200. And I'll leave that with you to try to do yourself. The basic code is the same as we saw before. Okay, let's move on now to, so this is the actual final solution here. Okay, now, if you're interested in the advanced solution, then this is what it would look like here. So here we see I have my if and else. I'm simply checking here if the numbers that entered above are 12 or not. If they're not, then it's going to print an error. If they are, it accepts them. Then in my for loop underneath, I'm going to have an if statement which checks to make sure that the number is between 0 and 200. If it's not, then it's going to give me an error. Now, this is quite a simple implementation of this system because there's no while loop here to keep looping around in case they do enter the number. The program will just terminate and say there's an error in this case. But it's still more advanced, as you can see, than the very basic one over here. Okay, with that in mind, let's go straight to challenge 2. Challenge 2 is about saving up. Let's go straight over to our Bebras, and here it is. And this is saving up. I've taken this information and I've put it into the presentation, so we can look at it a little bit easier over here. And this is what we need to do. A student is saving her earnings from a job to buy an e-bike. Now, she spends £20 per day on food and bus fares. She wants to calculate how many days she will need to work in order to afford the bike, which costs £1,000. Your task is to write a program that calculates how many days it will take for the student to save £1,000. But remember, every day that goes by, she spends £20 on expenses. So we want to find out how long is it going to take to do that. Now, what the program is going to do here is we are going to take in values and they are her total earnings over 20 days. So this one is a little bit more complicated than the previous one because we need to enter 20 numbers here. And what we want to do is we want to try to find out at what point will that numbers, all those numbers add up to 1,000, taking into account that we lose £20 every day. That is the challenge. Now, a couple of things to make a note of here is that we're going to separate them by spaces again. This is super common in this exam. And the values need to be between 0 and 200. So again, we could put that limit on that we talked about before, and that would be over here. We'd make sure between that range, but we don't need to. So we're just going to try to make it as simple as possible first, and then we'll see how it goes. Okay, so let's go straight over to our code and let's make this. Okay. Now, as is usual in this type of program, we need to make a variable called numbers. And we're going to take an input. Again, you could just leave it like that if you want, but I'm just going to enter 20 numbers separated by a space. It's really challenging when you don't do this because the user just sees nothing. You know, they don't see any prompt to say, please enter a number, nothing. So it's really a good idea to do that. And we're going to do the code all in one go. So let's get that split on the end. Okay. Now what we need to do is, because we're going to use these numbers within the code, we need to convert them into integers. So to do that, we're going to run around a for loop. Now, if anybody's wondering why do we use a for loop, is we use a for loop when we have a fixed number of values. So if I know there's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 values, I use a for loop. If you don't know how many numbers you're going to use, you use a while loop. So I'm going to run around these for however many numbers are inside that value there. Okay, and then I'm going to set my numbers, set my index. This index here should be the same name as this. It doesn't have to be I, it can be anything you want. That is the variable that will change as we go around the for loop. So we're now going to cast every value into an integer, and we're going to place it into numbers. So at this point here, we have now taken in 20 numbers. We've separated them out into individual elements that have been split into numbers. And now we are actually taking each one of those split numbers and making an integer. So at line 6 here, we now have 20 integers. Okay, we can start our code. Now the saving target is £1,000 and our initial total is declared as being 0. Okay, now the only other variable we need is actually days. So let's start with day 1. Now think to yourself what we're going to use to do this. Well, the easiest way of doing this is actually just run around in a for loop and count the actual values. So let's do that. For number in numbers, we can call these variables anything we want. So we can call it daily spend equals 20. Daily earn is number, because this is the 20 numbers that we entered from the beginning. That's the amount of money we make every day. So that's now going to be number, because this has got 20 numbers in here, and we're grabbing each one at a time. So very simple calculation now, which is total equals total plus daily earn, which is the money we make every day, minus the daily spend, which is the $20 we have over here. Make sure they are the same. Daily spend, daily earn. Yes, that looks okay. And finally, we just need an if loop to tell us when it's reached the limit. So if total is less than or equal to saving target, which is what we had over here, then basically continue is what we want to do. So days equals days plus 1. If they're not equal to target, then that means we've reached the limit. So therefore, we're going to break out the code. And once we broke out the code, then that's the end of the program. So now we can print the final answer. And if you don't know what I'm doing here, I'm going to use the format command, F. It will take you, I'm going to use a placeholder. That's why I'm using the F. That's the number of days. Like so. And this looks to be okay. Daily spend. Days plus 1. It will take you, okay, this is the variable I've got up here made. And we have all the code here. Okay. So let's put our numbers in. So we're going to try to put a range of numbers in now every day. In order to get these values, we need to put quite big numbers in, as you can see here. So let's do this. Let's go with 90, 150, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 10 numbers. So I'm just going to copy them again, another 10. And there we go. Super duper. We have a result. It's going to take me 9 days based on the information that I've put in to save up £1,000, assuming we spend £20 every day. Cool. And there is your working program. Let's go back to the presentation. And there is the code. It's substantially bigger than the last one, actually. But if you break it down, all we do is we just enter the numbers here. We cast them here to ints. Here we just set some variables. Here we have the for loop, which just counts the total. And here we just check the total. And then we just print the final result. That's it. So if you manage to follow me then well done. What would be good, really good practice now is if you could sort of close that, go back here and try to do that yourself and follow the logic as you go through. That would be great exercise. Okay, so let's move on to our last challenge for this video series, part 2. And this one is a little bit different. The code is a little bit bigger and a little bit more challenging. That's why it's challenge 3. Okay, let's have a look at this one. This is IP4 validation. What do we need to do here? Let's just tidy up all this code. And we're going to go to IP4 validation. Okay, here it is, IP validation. And if you have any knowledge about IP addresses, then that's going to really help you for this challenge. Let's have a look at what we're going to do. So we essentially have IP addresses. Every machine that connects to the internet, whatever it is, smartwatch, phone, laptop, they all have IP addresses. And they look something like this. Essentially what they are is the four integers, the four ints separated by a dot. So let's call them A, B, C, D. And each one of those numbers are between 0 and 255. So our job is to write a program to check if we have a valid IP address. And as you can imagine from the information I've just given you, to have a valid IP address, then all we need to do is make sure that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 integers, and that those integers have the range of 0 to 255. If the answer is yes, then it's valid. If the answer is no, then it is invalid. That essentially is all we have to do here. Obviously, it's a little bit more tricky to do that, but let's go over to the code and see what we can do. So now we are in the code editor, and we can now start writing the code. So the first thing we're going to do is make a variable. This is essentially a Boolean variable, which is either true or false. If it's true, it's 1. If it's false, it's 0. And that is going to be our main flag throughout the program, which is going to tell us if the IP address is valid or not. So what we're going to do now is we're going to write an input, and then we're going to do some error checking. And if it fails any of the error checking, then that will be changed to false, and therefore we're going to have an invalid IP address. So let's start. We're going to make a variable. You can call this anything you want. I'm just going to call it input string or input string. Now, again, in the actual Bebras challenge, you would not enter values inside the input. I'm just doing it in this case for testing purposes, and I'm going to delete them later after this, after I've written this code, and I'm going to show you how you can actually pass the Bebras with this. But we need to get rid of the comments inside here. So again, this is just for me so I can see where the actual input string is wanting me to enter the data. Okay, now I'm going to split the data, and this is basically called the delimiter. In previous codes, we did this with a space, but in this one, because it's an IP address, it has a dot, a full stop in the middle. So we need to do that. Okay, so that's it. I've set my variable. I've got the input. Now we are going to find out if the data that I've inputted is actually a digit or it's something else. If it's not a digit, it's not going to accept it. So let's start with our first for from the nested for loop. And I'm going to grab the item from every input string. So there should be 4 in this case, ideally. It doesn't matter how many there are, but we want 4. Now I'm going to grab a letter from each item from here. Now, again, that could be anything. I'm just going to call it letter in this case. You could call it character, which is probably a better option, but let's just go with letter in this case. Doesn't really make any difference. Now, if the letter that I've grabbed, so that's the individual character from the split that I've made above, what I want to make sure is that each one of those is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, is actually a digit. Make sure I have them all in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yes. Okay. So if it's not in here, then it's going to be invalid, false. And then break
There's no point continuing with the code if it's invalid. We're going to align this now with a for and say, if not is valid, then break. Yeah, so that's our first error checking to see if it's actually a digit 0 to 9 because they're accepted. Now let's check. The first thing we want to do is we know because of the split command here, even though we've entered numbers, we know that these are actually strings. So what we have to do is we have to convert these. I'm going to call info. I need to make a list here. And what we want to do now is we want to check, is it valid? So in other words, we want to take out the characters that we've taken, and we want to make sure that they are actually numbers. So to do that, we're simply going to convert them into integers. And that is something called casting. So for item in input string, I'm going to grab info, which is a list, and I'm going to use a function called append, and that's going to add casted form of my value, which is basically going to be an integer now. So at this point in the code, I've now made a new list. I've converted all the individual parts of this into integers, so they are real numbers now. Now I want to find out a second piece of error checking, which is I want to find out if the length, but let's do length first. I want to find out if the length is equal to 4 or not, because one of the requirements is we need 4 integers. If we do not have 4 separate integers, then it's invalid. So we go back to is valid, and we say if it fails this test, it's false. Now, can you think of what the next test needs to be? We've checked if they're all digits. We've checked if there's 4 of them. We now need to check if it's in the range of 0 to 255. So that's why we have to do this one first. We have to convert it into an integer so that we can check if it's within the range. So if is valid, then for, we're going to use the same terminology, which is item in info, make some space. And now a simple check, which is if the item is less than 0 or item is greater than 255, then is valid is false again. And then we're going to break out. There's no point running the code. If it's false, that's it. Just break out and finish. Okay, so I've now checked if there's 4 digits. I've now checked if they're digits, if they're actually digits, and I've also checked if they're within the range 0 to 255. So my final command is it valid? And if it is valid, then valid IP address. Else, I'll just copy that print again. Need to be very careful with indentations here. And in this case, it's going to be invalid IP address. Just close them off. And I look on the left, I have all my blocks. That looks pretty good. So it's ready to test now. So in other words, it has to go through it's got to go through this error checking to see if they're all digits. It's got to go through this error checking to see if there's 4 of them. And it's got to go through this error checking to see if it's within the range of 0 to 255. All right, let's give it a shot. It runs, that looks good. I'm going to start with an incorrect one, because this is more than 255, and that should give me, if I scroll down, an invalid IP address. Correct. Let's go with a correct one now. 45.34.57.87. Okay, and it's valid. Yes, it works fine. Great. That was definitely a tricky one. Well done if you followed this. And it's got some really good code in there that you can reuse for other programs. Okay, so let's finish off this series of video now by going over to Bebras, and we're going to take each one of the codes that we made, and we're going to actually put them into Bebras and see if they actually work. So let's go over back to our presentation. Here's challenge 1, which is the cost of petrol. And here's a solution. Now, as I told you before, we're going to go to cost of petrol. And what I need to do is I need to get rid of the quotes and the text. They are not needed in the Bebras. And if you actually include them, even though in real life it won't have a problem, in the Bebras, it will not give you the correct solution. So let's submit the code. Evaluating, full score, and everything's passed. Perfect. Yeah. So if I had anything, just to show you, if I put anything inside here and I run that again, no score. Error, 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 error. Okay. So don't worry. Your code is not incorrect. It's just that in the Bebras, it will not accept anything inside the inputs. Okay. All right, great. So that's the first one working. Let's check the second one out. This one is a little bit bigger. So let's go over to, what's this one called? This is saving up. Go to saving up. Scroll down, paste it in. Don't forget, the same thing applies. Get rid of the comments and so on. I'm just going to get rid of all the comments as well. They're not needed. And I might just need to get rid of that. Let's just see if it works with that printf statement. No score. Yeah, it won't work with this one. So let me just get rid of this. Because what we should really do is just print out days. This is just for testing purposes. Okay. Evaluating. Full score. Yes, everything's passed. So again, in real life, if I left that F print in there, it would have still worked in Python program perfectly fine. So we got a pass there. Great. And the last one is the one we just did, which is this one. Let's go over to IP validation, paste it in, get rid of all the comments. And that looks to be fine. A few more comments here. And one more here, and submit the code. Waiting. Evaluating, that looks good. And full score, we've got it. Excellent. So thank you everybody for your time. We've made 3 more successful challenges, and that's the end of video 2. Have a great day. Bye-bye.